Hello, everybody, and welcome to Virtual Bourbon. My name is Steve Akley. We have a fun event tonight because we have one of our Dusty tastings. So this ought to be pretty awesome because Wes Hardin is here. He's going to lead this as always, providing us some background information, some brand history, and those type of things. And he's going to be tasting out some 1960s era Crown Royal. So, and of course, we'll compare that to the current one. We'll vote on what our favorite is, as well as what we think the Dusty is, and see if we can guess. Always fun stuff. With that, I'll turn it over to our person of honor tonight, Mr. Wes Hardin. Hey, Wes, how you doing, man?
Doing good. How's everyone doing tonight?
Good. Yes. Yeah. So specifically, Wes, when is this from? What year is this Crown Royal?
This is specifically 1966, and that date will be interesting as we get into the history and I go through it. That's an interesting date, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, 1966 Crown Royal.
Older than me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's true.
It's true. It's up there.
Yeah. It's always our benchmark for everything.
Older than Steve.
It's older than Steve. Yeah.
Pretty old.
That's pretty old. Yeah. So fun. So, and when you got this Dusty West, did it have a purple bag around it?
It did.
Really? It still had. Oh wow, that's a hell of a
bottle. So that purple bag's been around longer than you think it has, and that's a interesting part of the history. Yeah, it was came in a box with the bag. The box is different size, and it was not quite as like bright purple as it is today. It was a little more muted purple. Mm-hmm. But other than that, the bottle, if you were just to set that bottle and a current bottle side by side and just look at them from a distance, forget telling. The only thing that you would be able to tell is the tax stamp or the tax strip on the old bottle. But if you were to look at it from the neck down, good luck trying to figure out which one is which. Like it's literally same bottle, same label. I'm sure there's some minute differences if you really looked at the two closely. Yeah. But if I took that bottle and filled it with whatever and snuck it on a shelf somewhere, no, I'd ever know the difference as far as looking at it. Like it's literally one of the very few, if any, whiskeys that I can remember that's literally hasn't changed, at least since the 60s.
Yeah, I got this one right here. I think they change bottles twice a year.
Oh,
and they're custom bottles too, like with it, David Nicholson is signed it. I can't believe how many times this thing has changed in the last 10 years, much less, since the beginning, when you're talking about something. And this is an old brand too. David Nicholson, 1843 has been around.
Oh, yeah, it's been around for a long time.
Yeah. So crazy.
All right. We ready to get into it?
Yes, we are.
All right. So just, I think everyone here are veterans, but just in case anybody is listening that wasn't able to join us live, a reminder, everyone should have two samples. They have a number 1 and a number 2. One is the 1966 Crown Royal. The other is a current, whatever I picked off the shelf, I'm assuming 2022 Crown Royal. They are both 80 proof. It's always been 80 proof. And so we'll go in and start tasting and nosing these in a few minutes. I want to get into a little bit of, this is kind of new. So most of in fact, all of our events have been bourbon and American whiskey besides one. I think it was Seagram's Canadian Whiskey or Canadian Club. I can't remember which one it was.
Canadian Club, yeah.
Canadian Club. We did which was actually really good, a lot better than I thought it was going to be. I was surprised about that one. So this is the second Canadian whiskey event that we've had. So we always have new people come along, and that one's been a couple of years ago. So what I want to do is start off by kind of going through, we're very familiar with American whiskey, specifically bourbon rules and regulations in the US, but Canadian whiskey is a bit different in Canada. So I want to go over a few bullet points just to kind of set the rules for what we're drinking and understand why it is what it is. So if it's a Canadian whiskey, which Crown Royal is, it must be mashed, distilled, and aged in Canada. Pretty simple. Doesn't say where, and it just basically says it has to be mashed, distilled, and aged in Canada. It does not say the grains have to be from Canada. It just says that it has to be mashed, distilled, and aged in Canada. It must be aged in small wood vessels for no less than 3 years. So we know bourbon's 2 years, Canadian whiskey 3 years. So as a minimum, any Canadian whiskey that you have is a minimum of 3 years. If it is a true Canadian whiskey without any neutral grain spirits or anything like that mixed in it. If it's a blend of straight whiskeys, which Canadian whiskey is always going to be a blend, and we'll kind of get into that in a bit. It's no less than 3 years. There are some age-stated Canadian whiskeys out there. There's not a ton of them for a lot of different reasons, but at the minimum, you're drinking a 3-year blend of whiskeys. It must not be less than 40% ABV or 80 proof. And I'm not a Canadian whiskey expert, but most of what I've seen, most Canadian whiskeys are 80% or 80 proof. There are some cask strength versions of Canadian whiskey, which are obviously barrel or cask strength. If I was to research hard enough, there's probably some, 90 proof, 86 proof, some weird proofs out there, but a majority of what's on the shelf is either 80 proof or it's a cask strength version of a Canadian whiskey. It is kind of like at the alternate ends of the proof spectrum for the most part. Whereas bourbon and American whiskey, you've got proofs all the way from 80 up to hazmat level, depending on what the offering is. Typically, so also it may contain caramel and flavoring. So that's a big difference between American whiskey and Canadian whiskey. So you have to be very careful with Canadian whiskey and really look at the bottle, the label, and kind of research the ingredients to determine what does and what does not have caramel and flavoring. But it is allowed, although not practiced a lot, I believe, at least by the mainstream brands. It is allowed if a producer decides to do that. Typically what Canadian whiskey is, it's a combination and a blend. So the big word in Canadian whiskey is blending. So in American whiskey, we always want to know who's the master distiller, who's the head distiller. That's the one person within American whiskey companies that everyone wants to know about, they want to read about, they want to talk about, they want to interview. In Canada, it's the opposite. It's the master blender. Those are the rock stars, for lack of better terms, of Canadian whiskey. The reason is Canadian whiskey, what they do is they instead of having, and there are times where they will have a mixed mash bill, but for the most part, and Crown Royals included, what they do is they will actually distill corn, and they will distill out of rye, and they will distill out of wheat. I know Crown Royal has a wheated version. And in each of those distillations, they will have some malted barley just for fermentation purposes.
Versions, yeah.
Yeah, different versions. So whatever the grain is, and you may find some Canadian whiskey that has, experimental grains or things like that. But what they do is they distill those separately, and then that's where the blending team and the master blender come in. And so what they do is they're not blending a blend of mash bills as far as a rye base. So bourbon does a lot of blending. You'll have a rye based bourbon, you'll have a wheated bourbon, and maybe you'll have a bourbon with the high malted barley, and they'll mix them all together, and then you get you get some sort of blend. In Canadian whiskey, by practice, for the most part, they'll take the corn-based blends or the corn-based distillation, they'll take the wheat distillation, they'll take the rye distillation, then they blend them all together to get the final product. So they take the individual components in the distillation process, they do that individually, as opposed to creating a multi-grain mash bill and then blending that with other multi-grain mash bills, which is a lot of what happens in American whiskey. So that's probably one of the biggest differences in what they do in Canada. And that's why the master blenders are kind of the rock stars of the industry up there.
Yes. Like Dr. Don Livermore.
Dr. Don Livermore. What's interesting about that is he gets a lot of the credit. However, it's been pretty well documented that Hiram Walker was actually the one who kind of gets credit of creating this blending individual age mash bills to create the final product. So even before Dr. Don, Dr. Don wrote books, and he's kind of as it became popular, he kind of was the guy at the forefront. But back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was Hiram Walker who actually kind of created that process. So he typically is the one who gets credited as kind of
It's kind of an interesting a take on things, because they say if high ryes are in fashion, they can blend up to higher ryes. If it's lower, or wheat suddenly becomes a component that's they can make a blend that meets consumer needs. It's an interesting way to state it, for sure. So
what they can do is they can get quicker to market, because they're
right.
already distilling and aging the individual components.
Right.
So to your point, Steve, if all of a sudden the wheated phase comes back, and all of a sudden Canadians and Americans and everyone is like pro wheat, they can go back and say, all right, our typical Canadian club is 60% corn. We take 60% of our blend is from the corn distillate, and 20% is here and 20% is there. They can flip that around however they want.
They've got it ready to go. Yeah.
They've got it ready to go out of age.
In America, they'd have to then start distilling that different mash bill, wait for it to age and all that.
That's exactly right. So their probably longest putt to market is label creation in TTB.
Mm-hmm.
Or the Canadian version of TTB. Yeah. I'm assuming.
Well, it also just gives you a huge amount of flexibility on really honing in between batches. I mean, like if we take a standard thing we're doing, if you just take Jim Beam, they're taking a blend of a blend of a blend. So in math terms, you're taking an average of an average of an average of an average. And so everything's going to be kind of here, but they can in one swing make two, the amount of difference you can have from their distillate flavor profile wise. It's like you said, Wes, it's all about the blender. And they have more tools at their disposal than anyone else in the world when it comes to whiskey, as far as their flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why they can, as quickly as they can get labels approved and printed, they can come up with any new product they want to as quickly as anybody in any kind of aged whiskey category across the world really can, if it's aged at all.
Didn't somebody here recently do that in the United States, where they had wheat, rye, corn, and then they distilled them separately, and then they blended them?
If they did, they could not have called it a bourbon.
Well, it may have been a whiskey, but
it may have been American whiskey. Yeah. I'm not sure if they did or not.
But it seemed like in the last 3 or 4 years or so, somebody.
I'm sure a craft distiller somewhere did. I'm assuming.
Yeah.
But
the one I'm waiting for to happen is a 51% corn, 49% rye, or some, maybe some malted barley in there, but a very low amount. And then to create a bourbon blend, because it's called on the label whatever the majority is. So if you put 51% bourbon, that's going to be a bourbon. And then you put in 100% rye or 95.5, you could have more rye in a blended bourbon than you have corn, which is weird. But that's an American thing where you could and to my knowledge, no one's done that, but I think someone should, because it's playing by the rules, but kind of bending the rules. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely like everything else. I mean, Crown Royal is the top selling, top exported Canadian whiskey there is. That brand is I think like 5 years ago it was 7 million cases a year. I think it's closer to 10 now. It's a huge.
That is huge.
It's a huge amount. So and again, they can get the consistency by using the individual parts. I think to a degree they concentrate on the blending of all the individual components. It's just a different way of doing it. Doesn't mean it's better, doesn't mean it's worse. It's different, which is part of the reason I wanted to do this event. Is pretty interesting. A couple other real quick items before we take a sip of sample one. Distillation could be no more than 90% or 180 proof. So that's 20 proof points higher than bourbon.
Yeah.
So Canadian whiskey can go all the way to 180%, which we know, or at least a lot of us feel, even on the bourbon side, you get that high, you start stripping out a lot of the grain content. However, they can catch up in the blending portion of that and kind of rework it through the blending. Whereas bourbon is more, I mean, there's blending in bourbon, batch blending for sure, but it's not, product isn't necessarily always distilled with the understanding it's going to be blended. Sometimes, depending on how it matures, it may be a single barrel, it could be a premium offering. It doesn't know what it's going to be yet. Canadian whiskey, because they blend the individual components, it always knows what it's going to be through the distillation process, and they decide what the end product is going to be later on in life. And then for as far as Canadian whiskey, kind of the last point, in 1887, their rules were created. So 1887 was the year that the Canadian government and the industry.
That's pretty good. That's ahead of us even.
It is, yeah. And I put the note here that we were 1906 time frame when we sat down and said, all right, these are the general rules that we're gonna.
Bottle and Bond was 1897. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
before we were really doing anything. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What's odd was Bottle and Bond was before our kind of national American whiskey. So Bottle and Bond was pretty specific to bourbon, and we just kind of took everything and said, all right, American whiskey in general in 1906, here are the rules for American whiskey. So that's kind of a quick just overview of what makes
one weird thing
Canadian
that's worth
whiskey different.
Yeah. One weird thing that's worth noting, that's just a Canadian whiskey thing. Now, we don't see it in the US because the US won't allow them to do this, but you can have 100% wheat whiskey in Canada and sell it as a rye. That rye and whiskey are interchangeable. So it could say rye on the thing. But that's weird. They can't, like I said, you won't see it on the ones on the shelves in the US because the TTB won't allow them to bring that in like that. But in Canada, you could theoretically do that because they call a lot of things just rye. It's just, like I said, it's interchangeable with the word whiskey up there.
Yeah, that's
just weird.
That's weird. One other quick item that I did forget there, so we use charred oak containers, as far as bourbon goes. They say small wood vessels. It could be used vessels, it could be new vessels, it could be new vessels that are toasted or charred, or it could be any. It doesn't have a specific. It just says
it's weird to put the word small in there, though. What's considered small?
Well, I couldn't define like a max volume as far as 53 gallons considered small, and anything above is counterintuitive. It really doesn't say. I think it's one of those. That's
a weird word in there.
My guess is back in the 1800s, because everything, all the processes are so manual and so labor intensive. They probably didn't start out in 53-gallon barrels where they've got people lugging these things around and, doing all that manual work. My guess is they probably originally went in at smaller barrels and eventually went to larger. But I didn't see that in any of the research I had. It just said it's part of their standards. It's like the US and the bourbon. It says, container, but no one's putting American whiskey in a square or rectangle container. Like, you couldn't do anything with it. You'd want to pack that around. It's going to leak and everything else. So, all right, let's go to sample one. If you've got it poured up, let's start getting some nosing notes and then get into it.
Nail polish.
Nail polish.
That's interesting. How long have you had yours in there, Jason?
About 5 minutes.
Okay. I poured mine right before. I probably had mine in the glass for half an hour now.
Okay.
I get it's light on the nose, but it's 80 proof, so you'd expect to be a little light. I get kind of like a citrus fruit on the nose and a little bit of cherry to it.
Cherry.
I'm getting like the unglazed donuts.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Unglazed. I was thinking bazooka bubble gum.
Oh, confectionery sugar kind of thing.
Yeah.
I like the nose on it, actually. It's a little light and faint, but
it is.
And it always has, in most Canadian, I always get it's artificial vanilla. And that's why I joked ahead of time of kind of, the vanilla extract is, but it is that you the vanilla smell, but when it's not the actual bean.
Yeah.
You're getting a lot of Irish too.
A lot of what?
A lot of Irish
whiskey.
You get that,
Oh, okay.
You can pick up that artificial vanilla. And I think it's just from grain whiskey.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's probably that and a combination of, I think a lot of in a bourbon barrel, a charred barrel, I think a lot of those vanilla flavors start getting with that char. I think it takes those vanilla flavors and kind of moves them into the caramel butterscotch realm. But in whiskey, in barrels in Canadian whiskey, Irish whiskey, when they're used in either used barrels or new containers that are not charred, I think it keeps it in that vanilla realm. It does that. Like I don't think I've ever had an Irish whiskey or a Canadian whiskey that had that caramel butterscotch note to it. It's always been more vanilla, light fruit,
Yeah, the difference between new oak is going to get you wood sugars, and
Yep.
these are actually, it's going to be, you're dissolving the actual lignans,
Right.
the actual wood fibers.
All right.
It's actually really good.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I'm not sure, of course, they never tell you what the ratio of corn. All they say is the Crown Royal is a high corn blend. They don't say if high is 50%, 90%, 80%, 70%. It doesn't say. So it never tells you, but for it to be 80 proof, it doesn't have like a Kentucky hug, but it's got a little bit of a spice and a hug on the back. I would say that the rye content is higher than
Yeah.
than any other blend outside of the corn. Kind of
Yeah.
reminds me of a high rye bourbon type of thing.
Yeah. You kind of get the rye, a little sting, but to me, it kind of tastes like vanilla ice cream
Yeah,
on the flavor.
the vanilla is super heavy on the palate
Yeah.
for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also getting like a juice box kind of juice.
Mm-hmm.
When it's not, one kind or the other, just kind of generic fruit cocktail kind of juice.
Mixed berry or something. Yeah.
Yeah, this is almost like you take vanilla ice cream and throw like a couple of like fresh peaches or strawberries or something in it.
Mm-hmm.
Not a syrup, not heavy syrupy, not super sugar, but I actually like this a lot.
That's good. It's pleasant for sure. Mike,
Anybody
what do
else
you
have
think?
any tasting, nosing notes?
Mike's usually got some. What's he got going on?
I got like a green apple peel, but in the like in the old wooden basket, like when you used to get produce back in the dark ages.
Uh-huh.
Kind of has that barn dust. There it is. Put it on the wheel.
Barn dust.
I'm beginning to wonder if you don't live in a barn. You always come up with barn dust and hay.
Barn dust and hay.
Yeah.
And then yeah, a little bit of spice behind there, just kind of generic, good
Yeah.
baking spice. But yeah, I'm with you on the little bit of the rye zip, and I think I got too big of a gulp the first time, and I thought there was more ethanol in there than there is.
Okay. Bob, what about you, man? What do you get as you taste this one?
That nice vanilla flavor is not overpowering. It really lets you enjoy the mouthfeel on this one. It's got a great mouthfeel.
Yeah.
And the spice comes in after
At the end.
20,
yeah, like
30
afterwards.
seconds or so, yeah.
It's afterwards
Yeah.
for sure.
It's very, very tasty.
Yeah. Jason, anything else to add on that?
I mean, you can see why Canadian whiskeys like this are crushable for non-whiskey drinkers.
Mhm.
I mean, it's effortless. Even with that little bit of rye oomph, it's nothing that's going to turn anybody off. And
Right.
it actually
Yeah.
probably, even as a whiskey drinker, that little zip is what saves it and makes it, keeps you a little bit interested. You're like, oh, that's nice.
Mhm.
Even though it dies, 10 seconds later,
Yeah.
there's
Something there. Yeah, there's something there with it. So we've had 80s where there's just nothing there, and that's not pleasurable at all. So yeah. Mr. Bill, any thoughts on this one before we turn it back over to Wes?
It doesn't suck.
Okay. I don't know what rating. I don't know where that falls on his rating scale. We're gonna get this in writing. We gotta
It's
get it
one
in
thumb
writing.
up.
Okay.
Got a 5 out of 10.
Yeah.
No,
I had
it's one thumb up.
We had a
good.
class at the shop the other day, and someone said, we're doing a barrel pick, and someone says, I like it. And everyone turns in the class and says, you can't do that. I'm like,
You need to
first of
put a
all,
jar
Mr.
on
Bill's
the
not
sit-down.
here. Yeah, this is a live event. Mr. Bill's not here. And this guy who said it was a new guy. He doesn't know Mr. Bill. He doesn't even know the story. So it was one of the new people. But all the people, the rest that do everything, were like, you can't
That's
say
funny.
that. Yeah, you may have
Yeah,
a
you
check
could-
anyway from
You
Kevin
could do
Nealon.
that.
Yeah.
You could do a half a Danny shot of this, and it wouldn't hurt you.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This would be an easy one to do a old time shooter with for sure.
No, absolutely.
Not that you want to, but yeah, you could.
This is something to me that I'm a big proponent of. We get all the newer people to bourbon only want barrel proof. Anything under 120 proof is garbage. Give me barrel proof.
Yeah.
Barrel proof. I'm a huge believer. If you're going to taste whiskey, if you just want to get drunk, have at it. Drink all the barrel proof you want, pass out, have a hangover, do whatever. We've all done it. So if that's your game, then go for it. But if you wanna taste whiskey, American, Canadian, Irish, Scotch, it doesn't matter what it is. If you want to taste whiskey and you want to enjoy the flavors and try to pull out and understand what it is, if you want to taste and sip whiskey, I'm a true believer in tasting up and down the proof range to make sure your palate doesn't get burnt out. And I think long term it helps you, drink some 80 proof, drink some 90 proof, drink some 86, drink your 130s, drink your bottle and bonds, drink whatever. But I'm a proponent of drinking up and down the proof range, and something like this that is 80 proof and still has good flavor. It doesn't taste watered down to me. There's a lot of 80 proofs that you can almost taste the water in it, but this is not one of those. This would be one where, if you had a banger of a weekend and you had a bunch of buddies just pounding a bunch of GT Stag that you wanted to have a pour Monday night, you could go to something like this and still get flavor out of it, and it kind of give your system a day off and still enjoy a pour too. So
I mean, that's every tasting we've had with Bernie talking about EW Black is just that flavor, but accessible.
Yeah.
Yep. No, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big fan. All right, let's jump into a little history. So I want to get into the Crown Royal brand history specifically. So Crown Royal was started in 1939. It was actually created as a presentation and a special offering for the visiting King and Queen of England. So this was King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Surprisingly, I found out that this trip that they had to Canada in 1939 was the first time that the reigning monarchs visited Canada, which seems very odd, as old as England and as old as Canada. It was the first time that the reigning monarchs had visited Canada. So Samuel Bronfman, and I think we brought him up and we'll continue to bring him up over the years. He was the president head of Seagram's at that time. Seagram's was a giant in the whiskey industry, both Canadian and American whiskey. Samuel Bronfman wanted to create a whiskey blend basically suited for the royals. So the idea was to create this blend, be the perfect blend, and present it to the king and queen. And the idea was they were doing a train trip across Canada, coast to coast. That was their whole tour. They called it a tour. So he wanted to make sure that they had plenty of Canadian whiskey for their trip. So his group of blenders, they actually this is unbelievable. They trialed more than 600 blends, if you can imagine. It kind of gives you the idea of how many different possibilities Canadian whiskey has with taking those individual components and making all those different percentages and blends and so forth. But they went through more than 600 blends before finishing on the final product, which is the same blend that it is today, supposedly. And at the same time, they created this iconic bottle. So the bottle has cut glass. The cap is like a crown, basically, and then those original 1939, the originals came in the purple bag with the gold stitching. So we were talking about that earlier, Steve, that purple bag's been around since day one.
Wow, that's cool.
It is kind of cool. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really, if you think about it, 1939, other than something like presenting it for a king and a queen, who in the hell would think about putting whiskey in a bag and then putting that bag of whiskey in a box and doing that? But yeah, that's what they came up with, and that was all just to one time impress the king and queen, basically, is what it amounted to. There were 10 cases set aside for the royals train, and that was to obviously keep them well lubricated during their country wide tour. They raved about it. They shared it with everyone on the train ride. They shared it with different people at their different stops. And then basically from there, Sam Bronfman, in his entire whiskey career at Seagram's, didn't make a lot of mistakes. He was in charge of a lot of big time distilleries, big time brands, both in the US and Canada. And, he didn't make a mistake with this one. He decided, you know what, we've got a winner here. So let's let's go and let's start bottling it. So they started selling it in Canada, and it was only sold in Canada up until the 1960s. So 1960 rolls around, they decided they would start exporting it. The first year that it was sold in the US was 1964. So if you go back to the start of the event, we said that this was a 1966 bottle. So this bottle that we're sampling tonight was in year 2 of export to the US.
Oh,
Like
wow.
it's legitimately one of the first, I don't know how many they exported, but let's call it, I don't know how many, 7 million cases, 7 to 10 million cases a year for I don't know how many years. We're probably looking at, we've been sampling, we will have sampled at the end of this, one of the first, I don't know, 10,000 bottles, 50,000 bottles. I don't know what it was, but it's definitely early on. The first 2 years of export into the US. It's pretty cool thing to be able to drink a bottle that was just started to be imported to the US 2 years before that. Crown Royal was originally produced at the famous Waterloo Distillery in Ontario, Canada. And due to the age and popularity of Crown, they needed to ramp up production. The age of the distillery really didn't make sense to expand or go into it. So in 1992, they moved production over to the Gimli Distillery in Manitoba, and they closed the Waterloo Distillery. Their barrel aging and their bottling line remained in Ontario and Amherstburg, and both of those locations are still active today. So today, since 1992, the Gimli Distillery in Manitoba has distilled all of the individual components for Crown. They ship all of those barrels over to back to Ontario, and then Ontario, they age and bottle. The reason that they ship those to Ontario is Ontario, and it's kind of the southern part of Ontario. Ontario has a little more of a US climate as far as the 4 seasons. They definitely have longer winters than we do down here, but they do have the heat of the summer, and they have the coolness of the fall and the coolness of the spring. And so they feel that it helps the aging process. Manitoba is a little bit more of a cold year-round kind of province, whereas Ontario, they get some of that heat in the summer, which obviously, as we know, helps the aging of the barrels. So since 1992, they've been in the same distillery, they've been in the same bottling plant and aging. That area in Ontario, they have 50 warehouses on 5 acres of land, and they can store 1.5 million barrels at full capacity. It's a pretty big,
A lot.
It's a pretty big amount for one. So this is for one brand. This isn't, so like, let's take Heaven Hill. What is their capacity up to now, Steve? I don't even know.
Well, it's going to be over 500,000 a year. So is it being right about 500,000? And I think Heaven Hill, once they get their new distillery up and running, will exceed that by like 80,000. So it'll be like 580,000 or something.
So think 3 times that for one brand versus, we all know that Evan Williams and Jim Beam White Label are the plow horses of Heaven Hill and Beam, but they also have to take those stocks and they have to share with all the other brands that they have. That's how big Crown Royal is. Like, it's unbelievably big. And just in one store, 50 warehouses that can hold 1.5 million barrels on one piece of property is pretty amazing. Actually, I didn't realize that I knew they were big. I didn't realize they were that big though.
Yeah.
It's
Wouldn't you like to see all that? Like the warehouses, what are the sizes of those things?
Yeah, I would love to see like an aerial shot of like,
are they dotted all over the landscape?
Yeah, exactly.
What's going on there?
Yeah. I probably need to do a little more research on that as far as, how many tiers are in the warehouse. My guess is there's not, 50 warehouses, 150 or 1.5 million barrels. They have to be.
They gotta, I would think they go up high.
They probably go up to 6, I would say 5 or 6 maybe.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a ton of capacity to handle that Crown Royal inventory. Let's stop for a second before we get into the rest of this. Let's go to number 2 here.
Okay.
Similar nose.
Yeah.
I get a little more like of it's a little bit more of like a meatier fruit, like a cherry or a plum, maybe.
Okay.
It's just me.
I'm getting a hint of caramel in this one, but it's even then it's kind of a spun.
It's a little more fruit forward and less vanilla than the previous, I think. And in the glass, these two were pretty close as far as color goes, I thought.
So that might be the E150.
But on the taste, I get that heavy vanilla again.
Hello.
Yeah.
I'm getting some of the caramel this time though, which I didn't really catch. More vanilla on the first one.
The biggest difference I'm getting with this one is the sweet up front and the kind of the rice spice are connected. Whereas on the first one, they were two separate things. It was sweet and then there was a rye ping. And on this one, it bridges the gap. There's a middle to this.
Yeah, I agree. This one has a little bit of a longer finish than the first one, I think. But I'll tell you, I'll tell you what it smells like to me on the nose is in American whiskey, a lot of the barely legal ryes, I get a heavy like cherry mint combination with a little bit of vanilla or butterscotch. I don't get the butterscotch portion, but I get the freshness of like the fruit and like a mint or a herbal kind of thing on the nose.
What do you think, Mike?
I'm struggling to pull them apart.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be a tough one for me to decide which one I like the best.
Yeah, I would say that the flavor profile between the two is very similar. I would agree with Jason's context of the spice and the sweet are, just right on top of each other as opposed to having that lag. And then really it's just like everything's dialed up just a hair on number two. And then what I would get is I would almost call at the very beginning I think I was trying to get some smoke out of it. But it's almost like if you cooked like a cobbler or a fruit pie on a wood smoker. It's just got that little bit of wood kick with the fruit sweetness.
Yeah.
Very, very refreshing, very much like a summertime sip when it's hot and humid outside in the afternoon or the evening and just want something kind of refreshing.
It doesn't get me with the rye afterwards like the other one did. The other one had that, again, a little bit of a delayed fuse, but there was that rye spice. I'm not really catching that on this one. It's good, but it's definitely different for sure.
Yeah, I think it's less of a punch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute, Bob.
You're on mute, Bob. Whatever you said was probably genius.
It was the line of the night, I bet. All right,
let me try to remember what that was. I get nothing on the nose, but that could be a COVID hangover. I'm hit and miss with tastes and odors. It seems to be it's got a similar mouthfeel to the other one, but the flavor up front is watery compared to the first one. I get a little rye towards the back end. I agree, Steve. It comes on quicker than number one.
Yep.
But this just seems to be a junior version of number one.
Bob, I agree with you with the mouthfeel up front. Yeah, it's definitely a waterier feel with this one than the other one.
Yeah,
they're the exact same proof, and but yeah, there's other factors that play into that. So
it's hard to believe they're the same brand.
Yeah. Jason, what are your thoughts there, man?
Yeah, in some ways, this one feels even more drinkable because of the cohesiveness. It just makes it even easier to drink just because as soon as you taste it, it's going to be just kind of a smooth little bit of sweetness, holds together. The spices is like we said, it's less pronounced with this one and less
Yeah.
shocking.
Yeah.
It's more, it's just, just a hint of chili flake in a recipe that just kind of warms the tongue instead of that spike. But at the same time, I think the first one starts off more, I don't know, more hollow, more easy, and then needs that spike to kind of make up for it. Whereas this one just kind of hits the middle and stays in the middle.
Right. Right. Bill, we gotta check in with you, of course.
I don't know. I'm kind of torn between the two because there are aspects of both that I like.
Mm-hmm.
I like the cohesiveness, like Jason said on number 2, a lot better. I just wish that if it turned up the heat just a tad.
Yeah. Yeah. A little bit less inspired, maybe, than it could be.
All right. I'm going to jump on into the rest of our brand and history information, and we'll come back and maybe sip on if anybody has anything left, we'll do a last sip and we'll get our votes in, see how we go here.
Okay.
So we talked about Canadian whiskey, the distilleries in the company. The distillers aren't necessarily the rock stars. It's the master blender. Since 1939, I wasn't able to find out how many master blenders that they had. What I was able to find out, they had 2 since 1998. One was Andrew McKay. He's actually still with Diageo. We'll get into that in a couple of minutes. He's actually a master blender for all of North American Diageo whiskey, not specific to Crown Royal brand. Now, he was the master blender from 98 to 2013. After he moved and assumed he got a promotion, we'll just say that he moved into a different role. Joanna Scandella took his spot, and she is currently the master blender for Crown Royal, and she's been there since 2013. Crown Royal was, obviously, we know Samuel Bronfman created the brand. He was the Seagram's president, so they were owned by Seagram's from their inception all the way to 2000. So they were not one of these brands, the distillery or the brand, either one. They were not one that changed hands a bunch of times. I think part of that is they were started up after the U.S. prohibition. So we know a lot of the U.S. distilleries and brands went through this crazy mix-up after prohibition, where a lot of people closed down. The big 4 or 5 came in and bought everybody up. And then once the heyday was over in the 70s and 80s came around, then they started selling off. The big 5 kind of disbanded and sold off to more global people like Suntory, Diageo, Akley, a lot of non-US or North American based companies. But in the case of Crown Royal, they were Seagram's all the way up until 2000. Seagram's sold to Diageo, and obviously Diageo purchased the distilleries, the blending and bottling location, and the brand. And that's they're still owned by Diageo, and they've been one of the very few companies that have scaled to the massive amount they have, and really have only had 2 ownership groups from 1939, which is their inception till now, which is kind of odd. And it's odd in both American and Canadian whiskey. A lot of the Canadian whiskey companies changed hands and changed ownerships throughout the years, and distilleries closed and distilleries opened. So really, outside of them moving from the Waterloo to the Gimli, and then selling off to Diageo in 2000, when basically everyone was selling off whiskey all over the place. That's really the only change. They've been very stable. Interesting piece, and I don't know if I missed this early in the year or not, Steve. I don't know if you know about it, but this year, Diageo announced that they're building a brand new $245 million Crown Royal distillery back in Ontario. So I don't know if that's for capacity, or it may be with gas prices and everything else, trucking all that volume from Manitoba to Ontario. It may just simply be, maybe Diageo are going to move all of the production to this
Yeah.
new facility, and
And you can get
Emily-
a much more of in Ontario, you can get a much more consumer experience too. So
exactly.
Crown has a lot of fans out there, and I'm sure it would be a draw, a tourist attraction. They can make a lot off of that too. So whereas Manitoba, that doesn't really, I mean, a much smaller province. So
yeah. So I don't know if they're going to sell off the Manitoba distillery to someone, or maybe they're going to keep it and they're going to create one of their other Canadian whiskeys that's lower volume, lower popularity, and it could be a scenario where Crown the volume is such and the projections are such that much like Heaven Hill recently announced, they just need another distillery to keep up with projected growth. It could be that simple.
Could be, yeah.
So it's one of those brands. There's not a lot of twists and turns in the story. There's not a lot of ownership issues. They didn't have a distillery that burned down. Like, it's not a lot of the stuff we saw with bourbon in American history. It's been pretty steady, and it was designed as an extremely elegant higher end Canadian whiskey for the king and queen, and Seagram's, and then now Diageo turned it into an everyday brand, which now, you can go to the store and buy a normal bottle of Crown for, depending on where you're at, $29 to $35. It's not super expensive. Some people will say for 80 proof whiskey, it's expensive. I don't necessarily agree with it. I think for what it is and what we've tasted here tonight, no matter which one's the dusty and which one's the recent one, it's a very flavorful 80 proof compared to other 80 proof whiskeys, especially when you're outside of a charred oak container type of thing. So one piece of interesting information, and it's not really substantiated, but I saw it in two different places, and one of those sources I happen to believe because it came out of the mouth through a reporter to Julian Van Winkle a while back. So when Diageo, we know that United, which became Diageo, bought the Stitzel-Weller facility back in '92 and closed it down. There was aged stock of Stitzel-Weller, obviously, all over the warehouses. Some of that was sold off to brokers, which Julian ended up buying back and taking to Hoffman and bottling his old Commonwealth and some of the original Pappy and stuff like that. However, they had such an excess of inventory that when Diageo purchased Crown Royal, it has been said that some of the aged Stitzel-Weller stock was moved to Canada and small percentages were added to Crown.
Just as filler. It's great, isn't it?
As filler.
Yeah.
Which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have brought it up if it was from one source, but then I actually read it it wasn't really an autobiography, but it was a book written by an author who spent 3 or 4 years with Julian and his family, and kind of, it's more of like a memoir about his story specifically outside of Pappy Van Winkle. And that was one of the excerpts that came out of that, which substantiated something else I had read. So I thought that was very interesting. There's some early 2000s Crown running around that may or may not have small traces of Stitzel-Weller.
That's crazy, right?
That is crazy, right?
Whiskey that's so coveted today is some of the best that's ever been made, and just
by the way, by the laws of Canadian whiskey, is illegal, just as an FYI.
Really?
Yeah, you can't bring in distillate or aged from outside of Canada and they call it a Canadian whiskey.
Interesting. Yeah.
So for what that's worth, may or may not be true, maybe an old wives' tale. I thought it was worth bringing up. I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting part of it is just how it's unfathomable to us today, knowing what we know about Pappy Van Winkle, Old Fitzgerald, Cabin Still, and Stitzel-Weller, and Nicholson was there for a while. All those brands and that distillery, and all of the Stitzel-Weller distilled and aged juice. It's just crazy to believe how that stuff was literally just left in warehouses for people to buy for basically nothing. And then if you believe this story, hell, some of it was sent to Canada to put in Crown Royal, for God's sake. Like it's amazing. Like, you would never think that today, but it just goes to show you how downtrodden the American whiskey and bourbon industry were in the mid 80s all the way to the mid 2000s. Once the boom kind of started coming back, is like they literally couldn't give it away. They couldn't get rid of it in time, which is how you end up with the Final Reserve 45-year tanked stuff
Right.
from Glenmore that tasted like wood, according to everybody that ever tasted it, and all the tanked Van Winkle and all the tanked rye and stuff from Medley that went into the early Van Winkle bottles and stuff. It's like people spend thousands of dollars for those bottles now, and they couldn't give the shit away back then. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, same thing happened with Scotch. I mean, the number of distilleries that got mothballed because they couldn't give it away. That now, if you can find a bottle, you'd mortgage your house for.
Yep. Yeah, it's just a weird. Just show you how that it just shows how that industry is just roller coastered from inception all the way till now. It's amazing. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting way to kind of close the Crown Royal story out.
It's interesting to see, during my lifetime, how Crown Royal has evolved. When I was a kid and my dad, had his home bar and his buddies would come over, the Crown Royal was the best whiskey you could drink. That was saved for when he and his buddies, they all had the Crown Royal bags because they play poker, bring that over. And yeah, the Crown Royal was considered the top of the top shelf. And these days, I don't know what Crown Royal is considered. I think most people just consider it Canadian whiskey or maybe a novelty based on the bag and the unique bottle, and maybe nostalgic for people that maybe their dads also drank it or something. But it's just not revered like it was. It's still a big seller, but it's so different than when I was a kid, and it was just considered the epitome of great whiskey.
Yeah, I think probably I would say that. You're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. For the whiskey, doesn't matter what, just general whiskey geeks of the world, Crown Royal, the history is it's a premium upper scale. It's made for royalty, right? So it's top of the line, and it is good stuff. It's actually some of the better Canadian whiskey I've had that isn't barrel proof. But I think once you do things like create a peach version and an apple version, once you do those things, you automatically take your regular offering and kind of diminish its quality. Like people say, oh, well, that's
I get it.
Yeah.
When you make the movie Rocky and it wins the Academy Award, it's one of the all-time great movies. But when you make 10 sequels afterwards and they continue to get worse and worse, all of a sudden you start thinking the movie Rocky isn't that good. But no, that's a great first movie. But that's kind of what's happened with Crown Royal. The sequels bastardize the original product, even though it shouldn't.
Yeah, what they did was they decided that, all right, we're going to have 3 tiers of Crown Royal. We've got our baseline Crown Royal, which used to be top of the line. Now it's going to be your everyday Canadian whiskey guy. If you like Crown Royal, you can go get it for $30 on the shelf and go for it. We're also going to appeal to the younger crowd, and we're going to make flavored versions: apple, peach, vanilla. I can't remember what the other ones are, but we're gonna appeal
Fall Harvest or something.
We're gonna appeal to the younger crowd, and we're gonna convince them, hey, we're gonna, everyone says whiskey, it's gonna burn and it's gonna be hot and all that kind of stuff. So that appeals to me, to like the younger crowd. And then what they did was they said, but we're still gonna consider ourselves premium, and we're gonna have the 18-year special edition. We're gonna have the XR and the XO. We're going to do a cognac finish, and we're going to, so they've kind of broken into that 3-tiered realm that like Jim Beam's has. So Jim Beam's got their small batch and their limited edition. They got Jim Beam white and black, which are, right off the shelf. And then they've got their flavored whiskeys, their cinnamon and their honey and their, their other things. So they kind of, took some of what made Jim Beam so popular. And even Jack Daniels, they did the same thing. Jack Daniels has, kind of a 3-tiered system. They've got their 10-year-old, and they've got some of their
Jack Daniels is winning right now, by the way. They're doing some cool stuff. It's impressive, the things that they've doing just in the last couple of years. They're making them. I think they're marketing towards bourbon drinkers, something they never really seemed to care about before.
They basically opened their arms. Yeah, they basically opened their arms and said, "We're not interested in a turf war. We have our Tennessee whiskey, but you know what? We're going to make a bourbon too," which they already make bourbon. It's just that argument of Tennessee whiskey and bourbon. Right. They're basically going to say, not only do we is our whiskey bourbon, we're going to market a portion of it as bourbon, we're going to bring you guys over as well. And it's,
Yeah. Doing that.
It's a
The
smart
Coy
move.
Hill is getting them a lot of good PR. Those are highly coveted. Bottled and bond now. I mean, they're some cool stuff, man.
Their single barrel, some of their single barrel
Yeah.
barrel proof picks are called stag killers. Like there's a lot of those that have gone up in blind test against different releases of George T. Stag or just regular Stag Junior or Stag. And in a lot, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, that Jack Daniel's barrel proof slays them every single time.
Yeah.
It's they're doing some.
Well, and they broke into the rye, market out of nowhere and destroyed it quick.
Yeah.
They got a barrel proof rye coming, just like the barrel proof bourbon. I saw the TPB label the other day, but yeah. So Crown Royal, that's kind of where we're at. That's
Okay.
fairly interesting history with a little bit of bourbon tidbit on the end there, which I thought was interesting for everyone.
Okay. Well, guess what time it is? It's time to vote.
I like voting.
Voting, yeah. We're looking for two things from you guys. What is your favorite of the night, and which one do you think is the Dusty? That's what we're voting on. Pretty low numbers here, so the streaks are going to be pretty low. I think this might be someone's second in a row.
Copy that.
Mhm.
All right, let's start with Mr. Bill.
He's still drinking.
He's in the middle of a drink there.
Yes. All right.
Damn. I'm gonna go 2 and 2.
2 and 2. 2 is the
Okay.
Dusty. 2 is the favorite. Okay.
Let's go with Mr. Whitlatch.
Everything about number one, from the nose to the mouthfeel, to the palate, to the finish, leads me to believe that that's the oldest one. And it's also my favorite.
Okay. 1 and 1. So someone's going to get it right tonight. This much we know.
And someone's gonna get it wrong.
Through 2 people, we know someone's going to get it right. Someone's going to get it wrong. Yes. But you can't be wrong on your favorite part. We know that we're 2 for 2 on the favorite because it's just your favorite.
The last couple have been
Can't be
runaways,
wrong.
it's been pretty obvious. So I like having one that's maybe a little tougher to determine here. Mike Gascamp, you're up, buddy.
Man, I'm glad there's not a streak on the line anymore because this one would suck. I'm going to say 1 is my favorite, and I think 2 is the Dusty.
Split decision.
1 favorite, 2 Dusty. Okay.
1 favorite, 2 Dusty. All right. Jason.
Yeah, for the hell of it, I'll just do the opposite of Mike.
We've covered all the bases.
2
There you
is
go.
your favorite, and 2's the and 1
I
is
can't
the
apply
Dusty.
logic like this is, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the difference is cohesion versus
Not.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna go 1 and 1, like Bob Whitlatch. So that means the official vote, 2 for the favorite was number 2, 3 were number 1, because we were dead even on both of these. So the same thing happens for the Dusty. There was 3 voted for number 1 as the Dusty, 2 voted for number 2 as the Dusty. So very split here.
Yeah, that was. I thought this one was going to come out that way, mainly because when I was pouring these, you couldn't tell really in the glass which was which. A lot of times with the Dusty, you've got a little bit more of an aged product versus what
Right.
they do today, and it's a little darker, and the legs are a little bit thicker and things like that. But this one, I kind of had a feeling it was going to be close, and when I nosed the 2, I was like, yeah, I think we're going to be close. So the final results are the Dusty is number 1.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
Yes.
So the
Mike,
good
did I
news,
vote for that?
no, but so if the good news is, if you like number 2, you can go out to the store and sip on regular
Yeah.
Crown Royal anytime you want to.
I was hoping I was wrong because I'd like some more of that.
I was
Oh.
the biggest surprise I had was I don't know that I've ever really sat down and had Crown Royal neat and like walk through it and sip through it and kind of evaluate it. I've always just if I was on a beach somewhere and we wanted something low proof and the liquor store didn't have anything American whiskey I wanted, I'd grab a bottle of Crown, throw it in some Diet 7-Up and have fun on vacation at the beach. So it was always a mixer for me because I really didn't give Canadian whiskey much credit, which I've learned through a couple of these events that I probably need to start revisiting a little bit of Canadian whiskey because they do make some good stuff up there. But I was pleasantly surprised at how good both 1 and 2 were on this one. I would have no problem drinking either one of these neat, and definitely don't have a problem mixing it if that was your choice. I thought they both held up pretty well.
Yeah.
Hey, Wes, I got a couple of Crown Royal stories I want to tell you before we
Alrighty.
sign off. Last summer, my dentist and I went downtown for a beer one evening. We went into this dive bar that on a Friday or Saturday night you want to stay away from, but this was a Tuesday, so it was okay. And we bumped into one of his old patients, this old gal, and he'd taken real good care of her teeth over the years, and she loved him. So she's going to buy Doc and his buddy a shot. And I start looking at what's behind the bar, and there's not much. I think that probably the best whiskey back there was plain old Jameson. So that's about what I'm going to request. And Chuck says, the dentist says, well, what are you going to get us? She says, oh, it's got to be Crown Royal, of course. So that's what we had. And the other thing is, have you ever had Redneck Riviera whiskey?
No, I have heard of it though.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
It's a brand that was developed by John Rich, the country singer.
Yeah.
And Big and Rich. And he makes no bones about it. He loved Crown Royal, and his goal was to develop an American Crown Royal. And by God, if you ever taste Redneck Riviera, it is so much like Crown Royal that you can't believe it. I think he was working with a little distillery in Oregon, and it took him about 18 months to decide on the final blending. But it's clearly blended whiskey. There's nothing bourbon about it, but it's a lot like Crown.
Steve, I wonder if it's that Beaver distillery out there.
Yes. The secret there is the beaver anus that's in there. So, yeah. Now they got some sort of crab or something. They're harvesting invasive crabs and making some
green crabs.
Yeah, that's their they just do
raw crabs.
Yeah, that's.
I kind of want to make a Bloody Mary out of that though.
It could be good. It could be.
I think it'd be very briny.
It has a lot of they said the spices in there that you use in cooking seafood.
Oh, the bay seasoning.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff, like Old Bay and that. Yeah. So I don't know. It could be okay.
I mean, the Canadian whiskey is interesting because in a lot of my classes and a couple of ones I teach, we do some Canadian blinds and stuff. And what I've learned is the whole thing about Canadians being nice is a ploy to make it so that they get to keep the good whiskey in Canada and send us the crap.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, Canadian whiskey is going through a craft explosion like the US is, and they're having the same problems. I mean, it's hard enough, for us in the US to get craft whiskey between states and everything. Of course, they're not going to export it to another country. They can't get shipping inside their own provinces. And so, but they're doing some absolutely amazing things up there. I'm going to Vancouver on Friday, actually, and I'm going to visit Shelter Point Distillery on Vancouver Island. And they're making single malt that is amazing. It's right on the coast, so you're getting some of that salt air coming in and influencing your single malt. One of my top 10 is a JP Weiser that was a Canadian only. And we were talking about Dr. Don, it's a JP Weiser dissertation. And it's literally his PhD thesis was doing this experiment. And then he decided to do it. And that's what he made it out of. And it's like English toffee. It's delicious.
Nice. All right, gang. Well, there it is. Let's hear a round of applause for Wes. Great job, as always, Wes.
Thanks,
you always
Wes.
bring it. Make for some fun. You've got 3 events coming up. There are tickets available for all of them. Old Charter is the one that'll be closing out Wednesday. So that's a unique one because it's non-chill filtered, right, Wes? So it's
that's correct.
Yeah, so it's a time when they were doing a lot of cutbacks, and one of them was they stopped chill filtering. So we'll get to try some chill filtered Old Charter. Should be cool. Then we've got one that's IW Harper. A lot of great history to that brand. Should be a neat one for sure. And then last but not least, the one that was just added today on September 6th, Michter's. So an opportunity to try some vintage Michter's. What I love about it, it was distilled by Dick Stoll right in the heart of his career there. So really, really cool stuff. So Just a big fan of what he does. And I've tried some of the whiskey that he's made before, always liked it. So I'm looking forward to just trying the regular brand. Been lucky enough to try the A.H. Hirsch a couple times. But I'm going to like the opportunity to just try some regular old Michter's. So see what that was like. So
we're going to do, I think it's a 1977, if I'm not mistaken, Michter's out of Pennsylvania, and it's going to go against their current US1, which is their kind of shelf item today. So we'll see what's what. I think it's going to be interesting. It's a pretty cool history. It's a super popular brand now that I don't think a lot of people understand the history prior when it kind of came back in Kentucky. So we'll get through a lot of the Pennsylvania history.
Did everybody see the video Royce Neely released today about?
Yeah.
That was cool. So it's worth watching if you haven't seen it yet. He got some Rose and Rye. I helped him get that actually, because I knew the person that was involved in the program to bring it back. And she's not really selling it to anybody outside of Pennsylvania, but because I vouched for him, they sold him some, and which is very cool. And of course, he had everything. Dick Stoll lined out exactly how to make it. I mean, gave him what the pH should be and stuff like that. All the stuff to make that exact recipe that he did. And Royce is in the process of fermenting it now. It'll be distilled probably later this week. And he's going to lay it down for 16 years. So it's not anything that he's rushing to do. He wants to really create the same thing that Dick Stoll did, and as close as he can based on everything that he told him in that day that we went up there. Very cool project he's working on. It's just the kind of cool stuff you get to do. Neely just, it seems like everybody's just tossed him underhand balls because he's hitting everything out of the park, man. That guy's killing it here recently for sure. So that's just another cool thing he's got going on. So check it out. Yeah. All right. With that, we'll say goodbye. I'll stick around if we want to talk whiskey, that type of thing. But of course, we have our at-home audience. See you guys later. Bye.
See ya.
Thank you, Wes.
Thanks, guys.